Have you ever thought about setting a boundary with a Desi family member but didn't know how? Like when your parents give you unsolicited advice about your career or relationships? Or have you set a boundary only for it to be ignored? Like when you've asked your partner not to invite people over for dinner without discussing it with you first, but they do anyways? If you've never thought about the B word, you can just turn this off and go listen to anything else. But if you're like most Desis, boundaries have crossed your mind at some point. Usually right after a phone call with your mom. Now imagine you can set boundaries with Desis in ways that actually seem reasonable. In this episode, you're going to learn how to get past the hump of I'm not allowed to set boundaries because I'm Desi. You'll do this by learning 5 common myths about boundaries that have made the word taboo in the Desi community and why each one isn't quite right. You'll also learn what a boundary actually is. Most people who come to my therapy office think they're setting a boundary, but they're actually doing something else entirely. You'll also walk away with the toolkit with 3 different options for setting boundaries that aren't the cookie cutter versions you've probably seen on Instagram or TikTok, made for people in individualistic societies. These are some of the ways of setting boundaries that will actually work with Desis. And if you stick around till the end, you'll learn the single biggest mistake people make after setting a boundary, the one that almost guarantees the boundary won't be honored. I'm Dr. Heena Manglani-Terranova. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and Desi Dramas is where I let you in on how a therapist actually thinks. The patterns I notice, the questions I ask, the connections I make in my work with Desi patients. I'm going to share how I apply all of this to the most common issues Desis bring to my practice, so you can see the patterns shaping your own life more clearly and feel empowered to navigate tension and conflict with more intention. So the 5 myths about boundaries in the Desi community. The first myth, setting a boundary means you don't love your family. This one runs deep. If you really loved your mom, you wouldn't need to say no to her. The truth is actually the opposite. Boundaries are often what protect love over time. Without boundaries, you might start to build resentment quietly, and then that chips away at the very closeness we're trying to have. Boundaries aren't the opposite of apnapan or closeness. They're what make apnapan sustainable for the long term. Myth number 2, boundaries are a Western concept that doesn't apply to us. You'll hear this from aunties and parents and sometimes your own internal voice. The truth is that every culture has boundaries, and Desi families have enormous boundaries around gender, hierarchy, what gets discussed in front of whom. So the concept of boundaries is not new. What is new is a person's right to define their own. That's the real cultural shift. Myth number 3, good Desi children and spouses don't need boundaries, they just adjust. Oh gosh, adjust is one of the most loaded words in our family vocabulary. We're taught in Desi culture that we should be flexible, accommodate, and take on difficulty without complaining. But chronically adjusting without setting limits is not respecting the culture. It's erasing ourselves. And I see the cost of this in my therapy office all the time. Women in their 50s who adjusted for 30 years and don't recognize themselves anymore. Men who never said no to their parents and now don't know what they want and don't want. Adjustment without limits does have a price, and someone always pays it. Myth number 4, boundaries are about controlling other people. And I think this is what leads people to getting the process of boundaries wrong. And it's probably the most common misunderstanding I see clinically. People come in and say, I set a boundary that my mom can't ask about my marriage. And then they're shocked when she keeps asking. Here's the thing. You cannot control what your mom asks. You can control what you say, how long you stay on the phone call with her, and whether you engage. A boundary is a statement about your behavior, not theirs. And when you understand that, everything changes because suddenly the lever is in your hands. Myth number 5, a real boundary needs to be declared. This is what happens when you take something that's been created for people from individualistic societies and just apply it to Desis without considering the cultural differences. So then what is a boundary actually then? A boundary is not what you want someone else to do. That's a request or a rule or a wish. A boundary is what you will do in response to their behavior. Boundaries are not walls, they're more like doors of a home. They tell people how to enter, when, and on what terms. They make relationships safer and more sustainable, not more distant. A technical way of thinking about it is boundaries are if-then statements. If you do X, then I will do Y. The Y is always something you control, your response, your action, your protective move, not what you wish the other person would do. And most boundaries that fail aren't because a boundary was wrong. It's because what was set wasn't actually a boundary. It was like a preference that you dress up as a boundary. I told my dad to stop commenting on my weight isn't a boundary. It's a request. When my dad comments on my weight, I'm going to change the subject. And if he keeps going, I'm going to leave the room. That's a boundary because the action is yours. The ball is in your court. Now, here's where I want to give you a toolkit that's different from probably the standard boundary advice you've seen on social media. Because what works for someone from an individualistic culture doesn't always work with your mom on a Sunday phone call. In Desi families, boundaries usually work best as a toolkit where you gradually increase the intensity. You can think of boundaries like medication dosing. You start with the lowest effective dose and you only increase if the smaller dose isn't doing the work. The strongest dose is reserved for when it's truly needed. And if you overprescribe, it actually creates more problems than it solves. So the smallest dose is a behavioral boundary. For this, you don't even have to use your words. These are the boundaries you set with your actions. You change the subject when your auntie asks about marriage. You leave the room when comments about your weight start. You end the call when criticism escalates. These work especially well with elders because they don't require naming the dynamic, which often triggers defensiveness or shame or escalation within the family. You hold a boundary quietly, consistently, and over time. Eventually, your mom learns that certain topics end the call and she stops bringing them up, not because you announced anything, but because the pattern shifted. Now, sometimes the small dose doesn't work and you need the medium dose. That's when you set an indirect verbal boundary. So when a behavioral boundary isn't enough or the situation needs some words, soft language that avoids humiliation usually lands better than direct boundaries. So here are some examples. Instead of, stop telling me I need to change jobs, try, Papa, let's talk about something else. Rather than, you're being inappropriate, try, I'd rather not discuss that. Instead of, no, I won't be coming, try, I've got too much on my plate this time. Rather than agreeing to something immediately, try, I'll think about it and let you know. These give the other person room to back down without feeling humiliated. And in collectivistic families, this is often the difference between a boundary that holds and a boundary that explodes. Now, sometimes even that doesn't work, and you need the strong dose, and that's where the direct verbal script comes into play. When you're dealing with a partner, a sibling, a same-generation cousin, or a parent who's demonstrated that they can hold a direct conversation without it blowing up, this explicit script can become the right tool. And here's how it goes. I feel this emotion when you do this behavior. I need this request. If you continue this behavior, I will take this protective action. So for example, with a partner who keeps inviting people over for dinner without discussing it, you can say something like, I feel overwhelmed when you invite people over without discussing it with me first. I need us to plan these together. If it keeps happening, I'm going to make my own plans for that night. This script works beautifully when used in the right context. It's clear, it's complete, it puts the action on you. But, and this is really important, it can land like an accusation when used with elders or people in hierarchical relationships. So try to use it when the relationship can hold it. And if it can't, then use some of the other softer tools. And of course, you may not know which dose is appropriate for whom and in what context, so part of it is trial and error. Now I want to share some real examples from Desi life and tag each one with which dose they represent. Being asked to mediate fights between parents might require the strong, direct approach, particularly for parents who can hear it. I don't want to be in the middle of this. If you ask me to take a side, I'm going to ask you to talk to each other directly. A parent commenting on your weight, you can use that small dose, the behavioral approach. You don't have to announce anything. You change the subject every time. And if it persists, you end the call. Over time, the call gets shorter when this topic comes up and your parent learns. Being compared to a cousin, you might use a medium indirect dose approach. Mom, I'm not going to compare myself to Priyanka, and I don't want you to either. Let's talk about something else. Aunties at parties asking about marriage. You can use the medium indirect approach and a little bit of deflection here. Auntie, when there's news, you'll be the first one to know. You say that, you smile, and you walk away. Who knows, maybe some of those aunties are listening to this episode and may back off a bit. If you want more examples tailored to Desi life, like what to say when a relative pinches your kid's cheeks when you don't want them to, or how to handle a parent who shares their worries on every phone call, and what to do when your adult child treats you like a bank, head to desi-dramas.com for the guide with 3 different types of boundaries and examples from Desi life. Now, I just want to make a little side note about managing guilt that comes with setting boundaries as a Desi. Setting boundaries with Desi family members can trigger this particular kind of guilt that you might not feel in any other context. It's that internal voice that says, I'm being a bad daughter, I'm being ungrateful, my parents sacrificed everything and now I'm being selfish. The reframe I offer my patients is boundaries are not a rejection of your culture. They're an attempt to find your agency within it. You're not choosing yourself over your family. You're choosing a sustainable version of your family, one that doesn't burn you out and one that you can show up to fully for the next 40 years instead of resenting for the next 10. This reframe matters because the goal isn't to go no contact. It's to have real, genuine contact on terms that don't cost you yourself. Now, here's the biggest mistake people make after setting a boundary. The biggest mistake people make is not following through. They state the consequence. If you keep doing this, I'll end the call. And then when it happens, they don't hang up. They stay, they argue, they explain. Enacting a boundary with your mom on a Sunday afternoon phone call when she's already crying about something else can feel impossible. But the thing is, every time you don't follow through, you teach the other person that your boundary is a suggestion, not a reality. And in Desi families specifically, this is where things get hard because Desi families will test your boundaries, often repeatedly, and in ways that can catch you off guard. Here's what that testing could look like. Family members may escalate the original behavior. They may recruit other relatives. Your father calls you, your sibling calls you, and then suddenly your masi, your aunt, is texting you about it. They may get creative in using guilt or stage some kind of emotional crisis that requires your immediate attention and that conveniently sidelines whatever boundary you just set. And this isn't because your boundary was wrong. It's because the system is testing whether you'll hold it. And, we therapists have a term for this. It's called extinction burst. Burst as in a spike in resistance to change, and extinction meaning the pattern changing. So the behavior gets more intense before it fades, not less. And if you don't know this is coming, the escalation can feel like proof that the boundary failed, when in fact, it's proof the boundary is working. And I'm going to say that again because it's a thing nobody tells you. When your family pushes back harder after you set a boundary, that's often a sign the boundary is starting to work. The system has noticed, the system is responding, and the system is going to test you to see if this is temporary or real. And here's why this matters. Even one failure to follow through during this testing period can undo months of work. If you stated that you'll end the call when criticism escalates and you've ended 5 calls successfully, and on the 6th call, the call where your mom sounds especially sad or guilt trips you in a new way, or your father gets on the line, you stay and engage, you've just taught the system that the right kind of pressure makes a boundary collapse. And the next time, that's the kind of pressure you'll get. So here's my suggestion. If you can't follow through, don't set that boundary. Set a smaller one you can actually hold. A boundary you keep is so much more powerful than a boundary you announce and then abandon. And when that testing happens, and it will happen, hold the line calmly, without drama, without long explanations. The system doesn't need you to justify the boundary. It needs you to demonstrate that the boundary is real. And eventually, almost always, the system will adjust. So what are the takeaways? Boundaries in Desi families aren't about cutting people off. They're about staying close without dissolving. They're about loving your family in a way you can sustain for decades, not just months. They're about finding a version of yourself that can show up fully to your mom, your in-laws, your partner, your community, without losing who you are. If you found any bit of this helpful, here's my ask. One of the most beautiful things about being Desi is how widespread our community is. We're scattered across cities and countries, but we find each other. If today's episode reached you, please share it with one person in your community who might need it too. That's how this kind of work spreads, through us to each other. This isn't therapy, but I trust it has been therapeutic. Until next time, take good care.